Hello and welcome to our final topic in macroeconomics that we are going to cover in this class. It deals with international trade. Uh, I included these because one of the things about macroeconomics that's really happening these days is inflation, a mild recession, prices are climbing up. So we need to look back and see what principles of economics we can use to have more competition in the market and to raise our growth and probably see more GDP. And one of the ways that we learned in one of the very first topics of macroeconomics, GDP and national income accounting, is international trade. If you go back to GDP, just very quickly, you will recall that GDP itself on the expenditure side is C plus IG. C is domestic private consumption. IG is gross private domestic investment plus G, government purchases or expenditure, and X minus M. So that makes this last component very special because we know these are all parts that would be affected by domestic increase in prices like inflation and all these. So what are we going to see in international trade and some of the effects we can talk about in the light of what is going on in the world right now? What is going on with exports? X was exports and M was imports. So that's just as a quick intro on where we are focused right now. We are towards the end of our macroeconomics course. And so it's good to see the last component here talking about freeing up the domestic market and seeing how international trade can help us. So some of the things that you will find useful to remember what we are doing here is first of all, the economic basis for trade, supply and demand analysis. That means, first of all, we will talk about comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is nothing but the way we dealt about in chapter 2. One of the fundamentals of microeconomics is like you do specialization, you have a lower opportunity cost of producing something, and based on that, when you specialize in that product, in that particular product, you do have an economic basis for trade. So we use comparative advantage, specialization, and all these ideas of opportunity costs that we covered in microeconomics earlier and put it as the economic basis for trade. Supply and demand analysis goes hand in hand. Chapter 3, demand and supply in microeconomics, put that, and we have used demand and supply curves all through our course. So the supply and demand analysis of exports and imports, now opening it up, how do we manage international trade, trade barriers, export subsidies, a case for protection, and talking about some of the multilateral trade agreements like GATT, like NAFTA, etc., etc. So some snapshots of what we are doing here. I wish I could just bring Okay, I wanted to bring some of the other slides in here, but I guess I will just continue with some of these things we are seeing in trade. One of the things, of course, are what is trade deficit and is trade surplus. We know about budget deficits and budget surplus. Recall budget deficits would be whatever your revenues, your expenditures are over your revenues, whereas surplus would be your revenues exceed your expenditure. Now, the same logic for trade deficit, let's go back to that GDP thing again. And as we recall, a trade, this X minus M being larger, X minus M greater than 0, or your exports, which are bringing, your exports going to other countries, bringing in the revenue greater than imports, will result in trade surplus. In the last 3 decades, the only time American economy probably has seen a lot of trade surplus was in the mid-90s. Exports minus imports less than 0, or imports exceed exports. So remember, importing, if you know the term importing, excuse me. You are actually paying the money for that. And if that kind of exceeds your exports from the country, it will result in trade deficit. So what do we see here? The US trade deficit with China was this much in 2018. Trade deficit in goods, trade surplus in services. US economy does really good in services. 2018 stats, we can bring it 5 years forward. The same things, much of the stats have not changed so much, so I never changed much of these. But we need to know about these terms. Exports are 12% of US output, more or less the same stats till now. What are some of the principal US exports? Again, part of our snapshots. US is big on agriculture products, sugarcane, corn, etc. Over the last few years, Brazil has taken over some of the vital US exports of agriculture products like sugarcane. However, US still remains a world leader in computer software and services and aircraft material. Usually, you know that Boeing is one of the most expensive and one of the principal and most important US exports across the world. That material, that aluminium used in making Boeing aircrafts by United States is a much attractive thing for the rest of the world. So United States almost 10% world exports. What are some of the US imports? Oh, before I move on, computer software and services. US is big in computer software. I always take these as an example when I illustrate comparative advantage in my classes, that US, whereas China is a big manufacturing country, manufactured products are exported or hardware is exported from China. The licensed software are the big exports from United States, apart from chemicals and agriculture products. Consumer durables, as you know, are some of the durable appliances. Whereas US has done much better with petroleum and oil, with oil mostly over the last few decades. In fact, it has become a world leader in energy exports right now. So there was a time when petroleum was big in US imports, automobiles, metals. It doesn't mean that US is importing a lot of these, but we do have some foreign market entry already accomplished in the 1980s. Foreign automobiles have dominated the US market. Household appliances, computers themselves, the hardware manufactured in China. These are the imports. US is bringing them in. These are some of the top 8 exporting countries as percentage share of world exports in the world. And United States is pretty close. Belgium exports a lot of stuff, and Netherlands too, Germany too. So pretty close, Netherlands and Belgium in terms of the world exporting countries of 2018 data. So that's just a snapshot, and we can always upgrade this data. I can give you more statistics, but what is interesting is to know what are trade deficits, how exports and imports are really feeling in the GDP equation. And as we know, GDP is the vehicle of growth, so economic growth is much propelled by international trade. So how do we make a case for trade? That's the next section we are going to. One of the most important things in economics to know, and this is the very time-tested old Ricardian theory, David Ricardo, famous English economist who kind of propounded all these, is that countries are sometimes endowed with certain goods or products. So when we say that, well, US is exporting a large amount of software products, part of the reason is US has a lot of capital intensity in its production. So basically, when we see this kind of hard manufactured industries versus very highly capital intensive, very highly technologically intensive industries in countries, we are actually laying out an economic basis for trade. So when I say that US is capital intensive in its production, and many developing countries are more labor intensive and land intensive in its production, I'm just saying that US has a large amount of capital, and the production itself, if you recall, some of the stuff done in macroeconomics, production intensity is another name of production intensity. One way of interpreting it is productivity. And remember, productivity, all this stems from the same idea. Productivity equals how much output produced in a given period of time, and units inputs needed, inputs or factors used. So if you're using less inputs or factors, your productivity is obviously going up. And what are these resources? If US is capital rich or highly technical in its production, even the agriculture sector in US is so technologically advanced that anyone from the developing country would be like very, very impressed. It's capital rich or highly technical in its production, then using capital resources, it can maximize its productivity, and thus, productivity and thus produce a lot of capital intensive products, like the technologically advanced products like software, much more efficient. That is another way of knowing about efficiency. Like you are producing it, your productivity is going up, so you kind of make those products. Whereas if you make a contrast with developing countries, economies, they are more land or labor intensive. US has a lot of land too. You can say, well, land is plenty in US for agriculture and all these. Some of the states in the Intermountain West and in the Great Plains are rich in land resources. But if you use technology efficiently with that land, you're producing something more capital intensive. They're more labor or land intensive, low in capital intensity. So they are more efficient in production of labor intensive or land intensive, products. Okay, labor or land intensive, whatever you believe. Some countries also, apart from United States, has vast amount of lands. So let's take the Middle East, vast amount of oil resources. So they are producing it efficiently and also kind of exporting it. So talking about exporting, the economic basis of these exporting and importing is all about this efficiency and how we tie efficiency, specialization, and comparative advantage together. So if United States is a world leader in this software, if it's producing these things efficiently, we'd just assume that United States would be more capable of having a specialization in production of software. So what does this specialization mean? Let's illustrate with two very simple textbook examples I have out here. The opportunity cost. The opportunity cost was a concept that was embedded in the very first topics of any economics course. That means that what is the amount you forgo to from the next best alternative to do an activity. So it becomes a cost because you take away resources from your next best alternative and put it into some activity that is more efficient for you. So going back to our example, US can take away more labor and more capital from things like hardware manufacturing or things like, let's say, a little bit of agriculture products and put that into software manufacturing and, software production and make that efficiently, and its opportunity cost would probably be lower because these resources are more fruitfully or more effectively used in the production of software, where United States is already very efficient. But compare these, your cost will go up. Opportunity cost can go up if you are producing something inefficiently. We'll talk about increasing cost ratio, and you keep on putting your resources in that inefficient material. So for example, US keeps on putting its resources on agriculture production, even though it could pull away some resources and put it into software. So let's assume that there are two nations who are like these, and bring in US and Mexico. They have the same size of labor force, constant cost. These are some basic economic assumptions we are making. Let's say there is a different cost between countries. Constant costs mean that their opportunity cost slope is constant. So 1 unit of these is 2, so the ratio is always constant. It's not changing. The slope, in other words, is constant. So we have a straight line according to our algebra. So, but United States has an absolute advantage in production of both commodities. So opportunity cost is reflected in the slope of the curve. So how much of one activity or one product you're producing and sacrificing, how much of the other product. If you do not have to sacrifice much, it's a good opportunity cost ratio for you. If you're sacrificing more for the other product and producing 1 unit of that, then you have your opportunity cost is higher. You should not specialize in that product. Let's illustrate these and kind of expand on these ideas. So here are United States and Mexico without any complete specialization and trade. United States has a 1-to-1 ratio in production of beef and vegetables. Why do I say 1-to-1? If you see the slope, if it just sacrifices all 30 tons of beef, it can produce 30 tons of vegetables. It sacrifices all the vegetables, it can produce 30 tons of beef. So 1:1 ratio, 30 sacrifice, 30 constant, 1:1. Whereas for Mexico, it's a little different. If Mexico sacrifices 20 tons of vegetables, it only gets 10 tons of extra beef. If it sacrifices 10 tons of beef, of course, it can actually have more production of vegetables. So in other words, if you see these ratios, if I can make these ratios clear here. In the US structure, opportunity cost ratio equals 1:1. 1 ton of beef given up in order to produce, if you want to, it's just, you don't have to give up, it can produce both. But 1 ton of given up in order to produce 1 ton of vegetables and vice versa. United States has an absolute advantage because look at Mexico's case. This is the US. And let's just make Mexico out here. Okay, the opportunity cost ratio, excuse me. Now remember, Mexico could make 20 tons of vegetables and only make 10 tons of beef. So if it gives up 10 tons, it gets 20 tons of vegetables. So Mexico's is 2:1. If you give up, like you can make 1 unit of beef, whereas US could make 1 unit of beef and only give up 1 unit of vegetable. It will give up, or Mexico has to give up 2 units of vegetables in order to get that 1 unit of beef. So if you compare and contrast these situations, 2 tons of vegetables to be given up in order to produce 1 ton of beef. Yeah, if you compare and contrast these situations, obviously Mexico is having a higher opportunity cost in terms of beef production. Whereas US has 1:1 ratio, means it has an absolute advantage in production of both. It can make both, as I said. But is it efficient for both these countries to make both and keep on producing? Why not open up trade where both can facilitate efficiency and production in a manner that's advantageous to both? This is the law of comparative advantage. So I put the two pictures for both, for the US case and the Mexico case. As you can see, Mexico has a higher opportunity cost of beef. If it wants to make 1 ton of beef, it has to give up more vegetables. So let Mexico take care of vegetables because it is cheaper to make vegetables. It's expensive to make beef. Whereas for US, let's stick with beef. It can make both, but let's stick with beef. Draw the resources away from vegetables into making beef. This is the theory of comparative advantage. Let's look at the graphics again. Comparative advantage is what I just said: produce the good with the lowest domestic opportunity cost. Remember, the comparative advantage, or the opportunity cost or comparative advantage definitions as were done previously was you have a comparative advantage if the lowest opportunity cost of producing that product. It is the same thing. We are saying lowest domestic opportunity cost. Putting the word domestic means instantly that within the country. Now let's open up trade and see if this comparative advantage is working. I said, well, let United States produce all beef. Okay. Somehow they were producing, let's say, 18 beefs. Let's say this was a good output mix. Excuse me. This was a good output mix. It was like it was splitting its resources, not specializing at all. It was making 12 tons of vegetables, more beef, whereas Mexico was making 4 tons of vegetables and 8 tons of beef. It's according to the demand in the domestic economy. These are just hypothetical numbers. This was what we will call the output mix. But see these. If we really follow comparative advantage and specialization, United States don't have to make 18 beef or any vegetables at all. Make all the beef in the world. You can specialize in beef, make 0 vegetables, and get the vegetables from Mexico. What is Mexico doing? Mexico is making 8 tons of beef and 4 tons of vegetables. Just specialize in vegetables because you have a lower opportunity cost of making that. Beef is expensive as far as the domestic production costs are concerned. So make all the vegetables. You get plus means you're getting it from the United States. You get 10 units of beef from United States. So United States loses 10 units of beef, but makes 30 and gets 15 tons of vegetables. Mexico gives this 15 tons of vegetables. So after they do all this giving and taking, that's trade. United States is left with 30 minus 10, 20 tons of beef, or whatever, thousands, and got 15 tons of vegetables. It was not making anything, got it from Mexico, whereas Mexico is not making beef, getting 10 tons of beef. And after giving 15 tons of vegetables to United States, 20 minus 15, it has 5 tons of vegetables. So what are the gains from this specialization? You can see it was making 18, US was making, got 20, even after doing the trade, even after giving 10 units of output to Mexico. So it has 2 additional units of beef. With vegetables, it was making 12, gets 15 from Mexico, gets 3. Mexico makes 10, gets 10 units of beef, was making only 8, gets 2 additional gains from trade. And 20 vegetables, was making 4 after giving to United States 15, still has 5. So 5 minus 4 gains from trade, 1 vegetable. So we need to have all these positive. If these are negative, this is a problem. Next question is, why 15? Why got 15 from? Why give 10? This is dictated by where you would settle in between the terms of trade. Some of the things that we are going to discuss a little bit later. Why give this amount and not that? It's related to what is more costly, how much I want to give up, and how much I want to procure. So always remember that Mexico wants to give up less vegetables and get the maximum for beef. And United States already had absolute advantage for both. And if it specializes and wants to do trade in Mexico, with Mexico, excuse me, it needs as much of Mexican vegetables or give with as little of beef it has to give up. So the same idea resonates with Mexico. I want to give up as less of vegetables and maximize my terms of trade and get as much of beef. So that's where they all want to gain and not lose at all. So this is what we already discussed, that beef comparative advantage is United States. Mexico has comparative advantage in vegetables. Let's write these down then. What we just discussed, US has comparative advantage or can completely specialize in production of beef, whereas here I write Mexico has comparative advantage or completely specialized in the production of vegetables. So that's comparative advantage and specialization for you. So let's take up some problems here. In country A, the production of one bicycle required using resources that could be used to produce 11 lamps. So what is the opportunity cost? One bicycle equals 11 lamps for country A. So 1:11. Whereas in country B, the production of one bicycle required using resources that could be used to produce 15 lamps. So country B has to sacrifice 15 lamps. Country A has to sacrifice 11 lamps in order to produce one bicycle. So obviously, who has a comparative advantage? Country A. I'm not writing this down. Country A has to sacrifice less. Country A. Country B has an absolute advantage in production of bicycle. It will also have a comparative advantage. No, this is false. We just saw that US had absolute advantage in production of both vegetables and beef, but we would want trade, we would want US potentially to have comparative advantage in beef and leave Mexico to produce vegetables. So you should work in accordance with your comparative advantage. It is a time-tested theory of international trade that two countries can always trade according to comparative advantage. So US cannot have a comparative advantage. Mexico still has a comparative advantage. Remember, if we go back to this ratio again, always think about the ratio. Mexico needs 1 ton of beef, it needs 2 tons of vegetables. So obviously for 1 ton of vegetable, it has to give up only half a ton of beef. So vegetables are less costly all the time and beef is more costly in Mexico. So obviously one country can have all sorts of absolute advantage, but one small country will always have the comparative advantage. We say that US and Ethiopia can also trade with each other on the basis of comparative advantage. Suppose the opportunity cost ratio for sugar and almonds is 4S, for sugar equals 1A in Hawaii, but 1S equal to A in California. So I write this down. Let's put these. California. Which state has a comparative advantage in producing almonds? So I will clean this up. Keep this. We were using this as our basis. So Hawaii ratio 4S equals 1A, or for making 1 unit of almond, Hawaii has to give up resources, for making 4 units of sugar. So it's kind of costly for Hawaii to make almonds. Let's see California's case here. California, 1S equals 2A, or 1A equals half S. So to make almonds, putting one as I, 1 unit of almond California has to give up resources for making only half a units of sugar. So obviously, it's cheaper to make almonds in CA. So even states can trade with each other. And so CA has a comparative advantage in making almonds. The same logic here. For the next problem, the opportunity cost ratio for fish and lumber, correct this, for fish and lumber is 1F equals 1L in Canada, but 2F equals 1L in Iceland. So I'm not showing this, it's the same procedure. It's 1:1 ratio in Canada, but Iceland for 1 unit of lumber has to give up 2 units of fish. So obviously Iceland has to give up more fish in order to lumber is costly. Iceland should specialize in fish. For making 1 unit of fish, it has to give up only half a unit of lumber. So make fish, while Canada should specialize in lumber. The same thing. Always look at who has to give up how much. Oh, by the way, this is also a logic for the terms of trade. So remember, we kind of talked so far about comparative advantage, who does what, who has a comparative advantage, who can specialize. Those opportunity cost ratios are really the basis for comparative advantage and specialization. And so how much is being traded, how much gains are being made. But I also told you in the previous example on the United States and Mexico that why are we getting this much and that much from United States and Mexico? Why are they settling for this many? It all depends on where you want to do these. So going back to our graph here, they would want more than their production mix. At the same time, like Mexico would want more than 5, more than 8 here to have the gains from trade. United States would want to have more than 12 vegetables and tons of vegetables and more than 18 tons of vegetables to have any gains from trade. So it doesn't make sense if you are not going up above. It's almost like growth. If you cannot move these production possibilities frontier, by the way, these are production possibilities, you cannot really do anything about your growth. So trade is a means of growth. You can only move your production possibilities if you can go and produce more and more and then trade more. So where do we stop these? Which are the terms of trade that are more negotiable for both countries? So therein comes these terms of trade, and based on which we have exchange rate and how much money you pay, etc., etc. Remember, United States will sell 1 unit of beef for more than 1 unit of vegetables, because it wants more vegetables, whereas Mexico wants to pay less than 2 units of units for vegetables for 1 unit of beef. Mexico wants to maximize 2. Let me if I am putting all the resources to make vegetables, let me maximize. Let me have more beef. I will have to sacrifice less vegetables for United States. So what kind of terms of trade can we have? 2V equals 1B in domestic production, 1V equals 1B. So 1:1 ratio for 1, 2:1 Can Mexico doesn't want to give up all 2 units of vegetables as it was doing before. Can Mexico settle for 1.5 or 1.75 or something like this? If we assume that, what happens is, then if we settle 1 ton of beef equal to 1.5 tons of vegetables, the interesting part is you can have your terms of trade. I was trying to show you how to shift the production possibilities frontier so to have more gains. So here is your gain. Every time you should be able to shift it to achieve economic growth. International trade or comparative advantage is trying to seek that. So 1.5. So 30 units, push it back, push it a little bit, don't have to make 2, don't have to make 60 units gain. If you can have these extra 15 units of vegetables, United States is happy. Whereas Mexico, do not have to push it to 20, 10 to 20. If you can just have the extra 5 tons of beef from United States, you were only producing 4, you can have an extra ton of beef. So the terms of trade 1.5 is pretty good. You can do 1.75 too. Anything below 2, advantageous for Mexico. Anything above 1, advantageous for United States. Again, remember this. We are going to illustrate with the problem again. Remember, for Mexico, United States, let's write this one first. 1:1 ratio. US would want more vegetables wants to move from the, whereas for Mexico, it's 2:1. Give up 2 tons of vegetables in order to get more beef. Mexico would want to sacrifice less veggies for its import of beef for 1 ton, right? So they settle in between. You have to always settle in between. 1:1.5 becomes the terms of trade. Okay? These are the problems that might give you a little bit of headache. The other ones, comparative advantage, you can always do through your ratio calculation like we did. But these probably will give you a slightly bit more headache, not that they're very, very difficult. I've kept the international trade at a very elementary level for our purposes. So yes, we will stop here with this problem in the terms of trade. The opportunity cost ratio for watches and cheese is 1 cheese equals 1 watch in Switzerland, 1 cheese equals 4 watches in Japan. At which of the following terms of trade with Switzerland and Japan be willing to specialize and engage in trade with each other? So look at these options. Let's see if I can copy and paste this. No, I cannot because I'm in slide mode. So Japan would want to sacrifice, first of all, who has a opportunity cost ratio, whose is how much, and who has a comparative advantage. Let's see. Switzerland gives 1 cheese and gets 1 watch domestically. Japan gives 1 cheese but can make 4 watches. So making cheese is very costly in Japan. Whereas making cheese is not so costly. It has to give up only 1 watch in Switzerland. So Switzerland has a comparative advantage in cheese. Japan should have a comparative advantage in watches. There was a time Switzerland was famous in watches, but Japanese cars and watches have taken over for a long time. Their electronic capability have increased. Japan has become very specialized in electronic products. But as far as cheese is concerned, agriculture, dairy, Japan has to give up 4 watches in order to produce 1 unit of cheese. That's unhealthy for Japan. So Japan specializes in watches, Switzerland specializes in cheese. Now, Japan and Switzerland can settle in number one. Why? Japan was giving up 4 watches. Japan can only give up 3 watches now and gain the same one unit of cheese from Switzerland, because Switzerland is now specializing in cheese. Japan can have this ratio. Give 3 watches, get 1 from cheese from Switzerland, so it gains 1. Switzerland had no watches, gains 3. Now, 1C equals half a watch. That's kind of weird because Japan, half a watch, I mean, Japan needs to have a cheese, but half a watch is something Switzerland will not settle for. Whereas Japan is not going to settle for number 3, because if it has to sacrifice 5 watches, it can just produce domestic production of watches. It is not settling, not giving Switzerland 5 watches for 1 unit. But Japan can settle for 4. Look at these. 1 unit of watch is 2 units of cheese. Let's write this down. What was the thing? Japan, 1 unit of watch, 1 watch equals 2 cheese. Whereas Japan's domestic cost ratio was 1 cheese equals 4 watches. So you can see that this is 1 cheese equals I may have interpreted it wrong from that ratio. 1 watch equals 2 cheese. Sorry. 1 watch equals 2 cheese. 2 cheese. Yep. So 1 cheese equals 1 cheese equals half a watch. Okay. So going back to our the cheese with 1 watch. 2 cheese is 1 watch. So 1 cheese is half a watch. And this one is still 2 cheese equals 1 watch. So 1 cheese equals half a watch. I think this might be written a little weird. Half a cheese equals 1 watch. Half a cheese equals 2 watch. Sorry, I interpreted it wrong. Cheese equals 2 watches. I don't know why I was getting confused with that fraction. So let's erase these. Japan's domestic production cost ratio, excuse me, because the first one is not feasible for Switzerland, cannot be. Japan would want to just, give you half a watch and all of these, but Switzerland won't have that. So 1 cheese equals 4 watches. Let's see this one. This one was half a cheese equals 1 watch. Or 1 watch. Cheese equals 2 watches. cheese equals 2 watches. So 1 cheese equals 2 watches. So Japan, this is acceptable. This is acceptable for both Japan and Switzerland. Remember, they can accept anything in between. So Japan will have to only give up 2 watches and get 1 cheese, 3 watches and get 1 cheese. That's acceptable for Japan. And on the other hand, Switzerland, think about it, it has to give up for 1 watch, it has to give up half of a cheese. So great for Switzerland. And it should not be bigger for 1 unit of cheese for Switzerland. So what were the other options? If it can give up this one, Switzerland is also happy. For 1 watch, Switzerland has to give up 1/3 of a cheese, which is also good, should not exceed 1. Whereas for Japan, should not exceed 4W, 4 watches. So this 5 watches, 3 is out of the question, cannot be the terms of trade. For these, it was 2 cheese equals 1 watch. The thing I was writing first, 2 cheese equals 1 watch. So it is like half a watch, which is good for Japan, but not good for Switzerland. If you export 1 cheese, you're only getting half a watch. And the same thing for number 5. 1 unit of cheese, half a watch. So 1, 2, 1 is acceptable, 2, 3, and 5 are not acceptable. 1 is acceptable for both. Switzerland gains 3 watches. Japan is willing to sacrifice that many as long as it's not 4. 4 is acceptable because, as I just showed, that Switzerland is getting from 1 watch, it has to sacrifice only half of a cheese, good for just like 1/3 here. Half of a cheese, good for Switzerland. For Japan, it has to sacrifice 1 watch and get half a cheese. Okay, or it can get 2 watches, and Switzerland has to only give it half a cheese. So Japan is between that 4. Okay, anything between 1 to 4 is acceptable for Japan. Anything between 0 and 1 is acceptable for Switzerland as far as cheese is concerned. So the crux of terms of trade, and I stop here, is to emphasize that you have to gain. You cannot foolishly take away all your resources. You have to reach a terms of trade where both countries have a mutually agreeable or beneficial point. And with that, I stop. And in the next video, we are going to really look at more of trading relationships, exports and imports curves, and equilibrium terms of trade, equilibrium price, and probably talk a little bit about tariffs, quotas, etc.